and sometimes forgot where they put them. They shaped empires, rewrote constitutions, and talked to raccoons. Some saw ghosts, some were ghosts, and one tried to buy Greenland. This isn't history, it's something stranger. A slow descent into the absurd, the forgotten, the unhinged corners of presidential humanity. Because behind every marble statue lies a man who once fell off a Segway, or refused to smile for fear it made him look weak. These are not just facts. They are warnings. Welcome to 99 Most Random Facts About U.S. Presidents. Democracy meet dysfunction. John Quincy Adams kept a pet alligator in the White House bathroom. The sixth president of the United States, the son of a revolution, a scholar of stoicism, and a man who could probably quote Cicero while changing his socks, decided to house an alligator in the White House bathroom. No plaque, no warning, no Secret Service detour. Just a cold-blooded reptile lounging in the nation's porcelain sanctuary like it belonged there. And maybe it did. Adams never gave a formal explanation. Not that he needed to. This was a man who walked 3 miles daily before sunrise and bathed naked in the Potomac River as a routine. The alligator, a diplomatic gift from the Marquis de Lafayette, reportedly lived in the East Room bathtub for months. Some said it was a statement of dominance. Others claimed it was merely for amusement. A few speculated Adams wanted to remind guests of the dangers of power, just not too loudly, or they might get bitten. And yet, when visitors heard the splash and hiss echoing behind closed doors, they didn't question it. They assumed it was part of the decor. Like the presidency itself, it just didn't make sense until you were face to face with it. Strange? Sure. But the only thing stranger than an alligator in the bathroom is what Gerald Ford did with a camera. Gerald Ford modeled for Cosmopolitan magazine in the 1940s. Before he was tripping on Air Force One or pardoning Nixon with a straight face, Gerald Ford was modeling underwear for Cosmopolitan. Yes, the accidental president, the unelected leader of the free world, once bared his abs and jawline to sell briefs. In 1942, with a face like post-war stability and biceps that whispered, "Trust me," Ford posed for a spread that makes modern political image management look like amateur hour. Ford's stint in the world of glossy pages wasn't a fluke. He was handsome, broke, and open to opportunities. The shoot paid $25, a week's rent, and the photographer reportedly told him he had the bone structure of a moral compass. He smiled. Later, he would smile less. What's most haunting about the image isn't the fact that it exists, but that it fits. Ford, whose presidency was defined by mediocrity and motion, was always more man than myth. No grand slogans, no hero complex. Just a guy with nice shoulders trying to steady a nation reeling from political vertigo. A placeholder with cheekbones. And yet it makes you wonder, if the face of decency wore briefs for Cosmo, where exactly did Lyndon B. Johnson do his interviews? Lyndon B. Johnson gave interviews while sitting on the toilet. Power is rarely quiet. But sometimes it echoes, ceramic against ceramic, through the sound of a flush mid-sentence. Lyndon Baines Johnson, 36th President, Texan King of Chaos, routinely conducted business from his bathroom throne. Not metaphorically, literally. Journalists, aides, and occasionally shocked staffers found themselves receiving policy briefings while the president grunted behind an open stall door. He called it efficient. Others called it a psychological ambush. Either way, it worked. LBJ didn't believe in boundaries. He believed in pressure. He believed in volume. He believed that if you wanted to see power, you needed to smell it. His aides learned to respond to questions about Vietnam, Medicare, and civil rights while facing the cold, hard intimacy of American governance. One man held the nuclear codes, the other held air freshener. This was not eccentricity. It was theater. It was dominance politics. The same man who ordered custom shower heads to blast water at unnatural angles used bodily functions like punctuation marks. He would rise, zip up, and ask, "Now where were we?" And if that makes you uncomfortable, good, Because the next president we meet preferred his therapy in oils and canvas. Quiet, private, brushstroke by brushstroke. George W. Bush painted over 50 portraits of world leaders as therapy. After 2 terms, 2 wars, and 2 shoes nearly thrown at his head, George W. Bush didn't retreat to a ranch to tend cattle or dictate memoirs into a gold-plated tape recorder. He picked up a paintbrush. Not metaphorically, literally. And what emerged wasn't the swaggering cowboy of the 2000s, but something gentler, almost disturbingly so. He painted world leaders, dozens of them. Putin, Merkel, Blair, faces he once negotiated with, sanctioned, shook hands with, or maybe lied to. 53 oil portraits to be exact, most of them awkward, some haunting, all sincere. When asked why he did it, Bush called it therapy, and maybe it was. Art as exorcism, canvas as confession. The brush doesn't lie. You can't sign an executive order on it. You have to sit with it, layer by layer, shade by shade. A nose too red, a stare too vacant, a smile that never quite lands. Like a man trying to make peace with his own legacy using acrylics and regret. The man who once declared mission accomplished now wrestled with the color wheel. And that's what makes it mysterious. Not the painting itself, but the fact that it felt like penance. Not everyone handles misfortune with brushstrokes, though. Some, like William Henry Harrison, preferred to smoke it backward. William Henry Harrison used to smoke corncob pipes backward to confuse misfortune. He holds the record for shortest presidential term, 31 days. But before the pneumonia, before the endless inauguration speech and a snowstorm without a coat, William Henry Harrison had another hobby. He smoked corncob pipes backward, as in he placed the bowl in his mouth and lit the stem. Why? He claimed it confused misfortune. Let's pause and absorb that. A man entrusted with the nuclear-level power of 19th century America believed fate could be tricked by blowing smoke out the wrong end. Was it a superstition, a joke, a pre-modern meme? Hard to say. Harrison came from an era when omens rode horseback and curses wore powdered wigs. Maybe he really thought misfortune had a face and a name. Maybe he saw it coming and thought he could outwit it with ritual. It didn't work. 31 days later, he was dead. The first president to die in office. But still, the image lingers. A man standing at a balcony, puffing the wrong end of a pipe, smiling like he's cheated destiny. It wasn't clever. It wasn't wise, but it was very American. And speaking of misunderstood youth, let's talk about the guy who would grow up to order drone strikes and once collected Spider-Man comics. Barack Obama collected Spider-Man comics as a teenager, before the Nobel Prize, before the cadence, before the teleprompters and the midnight gray hair. Barack Obama was just a half-American, half-Kenyan kid growing up in Hawaii, reading Spider-Man comics. No irony, no metaphor. Just Peter Parker swinging between skyscrapers, trying to balance power and personal life while quipping through trauma. Sound familiar? Obama loved comics. Not in the ironic, adult graphic novel way. In the teenager, floor-strewn, pages folded kind of way. X-Men, Spider-Man, sometimes Conan the Barbarian when he wanted to feel tough. He once admitted that the idea of great responsibility coming with great power stuck with him. Not in a campaign speech, in real life. And maybe that's the eerie part, that the leader of the free world once saw the world through inked panels and Stan Lee narration. Maybe we all did. But then he grew up, got serious, became no drama Obama. Still, you have to wonder if deep in the Situation Room, with red folders and bad options on the table, he ever thought, what would Peter do? And while Obama sent drones, Jefferson sent something far less subtle through the mail. A dead moose. Thomas Jefferson sent a moose carcass to France to prove American fauna was superior. Thomas Jefferson, the man who penned the Declaration of Independence, believed in liberty, Enlightenment philosophy, and, most urgently, American wildlife. During his tenure as ambassador to France, Jefferson grew increasingly irritated by European intellectuals who scoffed at the supposed inferiority of New World species. Buffon, a French naturalist, claimed America produced nothing but stunted trees and puny beasts. Jefferson took it personally, so he mailed them a moose, not a sketch, not a letter of rebuttal, a full moose carcass, antlers, legs, and all, shipped across the Atlantic like a diplomatic middle finger wrapped in fur. It was a massive, rotting rebuttal to European arrogance. The logic? If European scientists could see how majestic and gigantic American animals were, they'd abandon their theories of ecological inferiority. The moose didn't survive the journey well. It arrived less majestic, more decomposed, but the symbolism was intact. America was wild, raw, oversized, and not to be underestimated. Jefferson wasn't just defending deer. He was defending national identity, scientific pride, and the myth of American exceptionalism, with antlers. But as we'll soon learn, not every president was quite so noble or careful. Some, like Franklin Pierce, managed to trample over a citizen and walk away free. Franklin Pierce once ran over a woman with a carriage but was acquitted. Before he was a president, forgotten by most history books, Franklin Pierce was a man tangled in contradiction. Charismatic yet empty, drunk on both alcohol and indecision, he drifted into the presidency on a wave of bad timing and worse judgment. And then there's the time he ran over a woman with his carriage. It happened in broad daylight. The details are foggy, like much of Pierce's career, but the outcome was clear. A woman lay dead, and Franklin Pierce was the one holding the reins. The nation watched. For a moment, it looked like accountability might follow him. Instead, he was acquitted. No charges, no trial. Just a public sigh and a quick forgetting. Was it an accident? Almost certainly. But in the world of 19th century justice, almost meant nothing if you had the right name. Pierce walked, and history, conveniently bored by him, moved on. But it's a quiet kind of horror, isn't it? The idea that a man could run over a stranger, become president, and be mostly remembered as that guy before Buchanan. Sometimes the most haunting presidents are the ones we forget. And the ones who don't forget, like James K. Polk, they try to silence joy itself. James K. Polk banned dancing at his inaugural ball. If you ever wondered what it would look like if ambition wore a funeral suit, meet James K. Polk, the man who expanded the U.S. territory by over 1 million square miles and still found dancing too scandalous for a public celebration. At his inaugural ball, Polk banned dancing, not as a suggestion, as a rule. He claimed it was out of moral principle. Translation: fun was a threat. Polk didn't drink, didn't joke, didn't smile unless victory was involved. He ran the presidency like a battlefield. Every hour accounted for, every breath part of a strategy. His wife Sarah shared his beliefs. Together they waged a silent war on merriment. So when the ball began, the music played, but feet stood still, gowns swished, eyes darted. People whispered, "Is this a test?" It wasn't. It was just Polk being Polk. He conquered Mexico but feared a waltz. He redrew the map but outlawed the two-step. And somehow this says more about American power than any battlefield. Because sometimes the most controlling men are terrified of losing control and rhythm. Which brings us poetically to Andrew Jackson, whose funeral was upstaged by a parrot. Andrew Jackson's parrot was ejected from his funeral for swearing. It was supposed to be a somber occasion. A hero of war, a founder of the Democratic Party, and a man who left behind a trail of duels and debts, Andrew Jackson was dead. Gathered mourners waited for the ceremony to begin in the Tennessee heat, clutching hats to chests. But then came the sound, shrill, unmistakable profanity, from the pulpit. Enter Pole, Jackson's pet parrot. The bird had picked up its owner's vocabulary, specifically the parts not suitable for church. It began screaming obscenities mid-service. Reports from witnesses say the curses were so profane, so shocking, that guests gasped. The parrot was swiftly removed. It did not go quietly. Jackson, famously unfiltered himself, would have probably loved it. This was the man who once beat a would-be assassin with his cane and believed national policy was best delivered in thunder. His parrot was simply continuing the legacy, rude, loud, and unapologetic. A fitting tribute, really. The only thing more Jacksonian than swearing at your own funeral is making sure someone else, preferably a bird, does it for you. But not all presidents left behind feathers and fury. Some left behind candy, color-coded and suspiciously official. Richard Nixon kept a bowl of M&Ms on his desk, monogrammed with the presidential seal. Richard Nixon didn't trust anyone. Not his aides, not his press, not even his own tapes. But apparently he did trust M and Ms. There on his Oval Office desk sat a bowl of them, red, yellow, brown, each perfectly ordinary except for one thing. The container was monogrammed with the presidential seal. Candy, but make it imperial. It's a tiny image, but an unsettling one. The most paranoid man ever to sit in the White House, author of secret bombings and secret enemies lists, soothing his nerves with sugar-coated chocolates in a bowl fit for a Roman consul. There's something unspoken there, a hunger for control, a sweetness laced with surveillance. He didn't offer them freely. They were there for him, like the tapes, like the secrets, like the lie that became a resignation. If a staffer reached in, it felt like a dare. Would the seal bite back? In the end, it's not what Nixon did that's most fascinating. It's what he did while pretending everything was fine, nodding calmly while chewing on red dye #5. But while Nixon kept secrets under candy shells, Abraham Lincoln kept his where no one would look, inside his hat. Abraham Lincoln stored important documents inside his hat. The stovepipe hat wasn't just a fashion statement. For Abraham Lincoln, it was a filing cabinet, a personal vault, a symbol of height and presence, yes, but also utility. Inside that tall black crown, Lincoln tucked notes, memos, drafts, and sometimes whole legal documents. Because where else does a man keep the weight of a fracturing nation? His pockets? No. In the very thing that makes him look bigger than he is. It's both poetic and tragic. A literal metaphor strapped to his head. The hat itself became legend. Rumpled, sweat-stained, battered by wind and war. But always with something inside it, secrets, reminders, bits of policy jotted down in desperate handwriting. He wore it into meetings. He wore it during midnight walks through Washington. He wore it as his country came undone beneath him. And maybe that's the image that sticks. The great emancipator. Shoulders hunched, a silent note fluttering inside his hat, like a conscience with corners. Not every leader needs a cabinet when they've got a crown. But not every president was content with hats and symbolism. Some, like Calvin Coolidge, preferred practical jokes involving panic buttons. Calvin Coolidge liked to press emergency buzzers and then hide. Some men weaponized silence. Calvin Coolidge turned it into an art form, and occasionally into a prank. In the middle of a stiff-lipped presidency defined by restraint and monosyllables, Coolidge found his own kind of mischief. Hidden under the stillness, the man had a thing for chaos. Carefully measured, precisely timed. He would press the White House emergency buzzer, summoning staff in a hurry. Secretaries would come running, thinking war had broken out. A crisis had erupted, or the president had finally decided to say more than 4 words in a day. But when they arrived, nothing. An empty room, Coolidge gone. Or worse, sitting quietly in a corner, watching them, amused. Like a ghost playing games with the living. He never explained himself, but the pranks kept happening. It was the kind of humor you'd expect from someone who rarely smiled, who moved like a shadow through his own administration. Dry, deadpan, and just unsettling enough to stick in your brain. What else had that button been for? And while Coolidge made emergencies into jokes, another president found emergencies flushing back up. Literally. Because sometimes the real panic button is a clogged White House toilet. Donald Trump reportedly flushed government documents down the White House toilet. There are leaks, and then there are leaks. Staffers in the Trump White House reported more than clogged pipes, more than just the usual bureaucratic backwash. They found wads of torn-up paper, handwritten notes, government records, stuffed into the presidential toilet. Not metaphor, not exaggeration. Actual toilet, actual documents. Some pages were reportedly jammed so tightly that plumbers had to retrieve them like archaeologists pulling secrets from a bog. And though the president denied it, the stains of paper pulp panic were, apparently, hard to miss. The question isn't why, but what? What kind of information gets destroyed not by shredder, not by fire, but by porcelain swirl? There's something ancient about it, like a king burning omens, like a man trying to erase consequences one flush at a time. The toilet becomes an archive, a vault, a grave. And isn't that the strangest twist? That the seat of power, quite literally, becomes a sewer of state secrets? If that's not presidential, nothing is. But before there were secrets in toilets, there were secrets in kennels. Because George Washington's idea of loyalty came with names like Tipsy and Drunkard. George Washington named his dogs Tipsy, Drunkard, and Sweet Lips. America's first president, a man painted like marble and spoken of like scripture, had a soft spot for dogs and a strange sense of humor. Among his many hounds were three who made it into historical legend purely for their names: Tipsy, Drunkard, Sweet Lips. Imagine the man who crossed the Delaware with frostbitten resolve, calling for Sweet Lips across the lawn, or commanding Drunkard to heel before receiving a diplomatic envoy. These weren't random mutts. They were carefully bred foxhounds, symbols of status, tools of the hunt. And yet, Washington named them like barflies in a tavern fable. But it fits. The man who couldn't tell a lie also couldn't resist a bit of private mischief. He loved his dogs deeply. He reportedly dined with them, traveled with them, and wrote down their temperaments like generals in his journal. And the names? Maybe they were reminders that even the father of a nation needed company that didn't speak, didn't judge, and always came when called. Still, while Washington rescued loyalty from the kennel, James Buchanan was out buying slaves, not for ownership, but for freedom. A paradox wrapped in shadow. James Buchanan bought slaves in Washington to quietly free them in Pennsylvania. James Buchanan is a name that rarely stirs passion, except in footnotes or blame. But beneath his glassy stare and starchy formality was a strange and haunted habit. While living in Washington, Buchanan quietly purchased enslaved people. Not for labor, not for ownership. He bought them so he could take them north and free them. No speeches, no letters, no credit claimed. It wasn't an act of political rebellion or abolitionist glory. It was quiet, evasive, maybe even guilty. He didn't speak out against slavery publicly, but he smuggled human lives out of bondage when he could, using Pennsylvania's laws to nullify the shackles. And he never made a spectacle of it. Some say it was conscience. Others say it was cowardice dressed as mercy, because freeing people in secret also meant maintaining a face of neutrality. No lines drawn, no principles declared, just transactions with moral residue. It leaves a question stuck in the teeth of history. What do we call someone who does the right thing for the wrong reasons, or the wrong thing for reasons we'll never fully know? Speaking of backs burdened by contradictions, John F. Kennedy's quite literally held him up, and may have sealed his fate. John F. Kennedy's back brace may have contributed to his inability to escape during the assassination. There's something cruel in how the body betrays the mind. John F. Kennedy lived in constant pain, war wounds, disease, operations gone sideways. But he stood tall, literally, with the help of a stiff back brace wrapped tight beneath his suit. It gave him the posture of a hero and the stillness of a statue. On November 22, 1963, that same brace may have held him too still. When the first bullet struck, witnesses said Kennedy didn't slump. He didn't collapse. He stayed upright, locked in place by elastic and metal. A brace meant to support him became a vice that froze him mid-moment. He couldn't duck, couldn't fall, couldn't flinch. And in that frozen second, the second shot found him. It's a mechanical detail in a national trauma. One of those eerie, anatomical footnotes that makes history feel rigged by fate. A man who projected youth and vigor was, underneath, braced like a collapsing structure. He wore his weakness like armor, and it killed him. And while Kennedy hid needles in his spine, Andrew Johnson kept his elsewhere, buried in his desk, tiny tokens of superstition pretending to be luck. Andrew Johnson kept tailor needles in his desk as good luck charms. Long before he swore the oath of office on a blood-soaked day in April 1865, Andrew Johnson was a tailor. Needle and thread before speeches and scandals. He never truly let go of it. Even in the White House, deep in the drawer of his desk, Johnson kept a small stash of tailor needles, rusted, curved, forgotten by time, remembered only by him. They were his talismans, superstition in steel, reminders, perhaps, of simpler work, stitching seams instead of stitching together a country torn in half. To others, it probably seemed absurd. But Johnson believed they brought luck. He'd touch them before signing bills, glance at them before meetings, and in the back of his mind, he likely thought, "These kept me alive when I had nothing. They'll keep me upright now." They didn't. But that's the eerie thing about luck. It doesn't prevent the fall. It just gives you something to hold on the way down. And as we fall through another story, it's worth noting that not all accidents are symbolic. Some are just spectacular failures, like the time Bill Clinton misplaced the nuclear codes, maybe for months. Bill Clinton lost the nuclear codes, possibly for months. There are things you can misplace. Your keys, your wallet, your dignity at a press conference. Then there are the nuclear codes, those slim indicators of civilization's threadbare grip on itself. And Bill Clinton, the man with the saxophone swagger and endless campaign charisma, reportedly lost them for months, not left on a desk, not filed under M for mutually assured destruction. Lost, as in vanished. The codes, usually sealed in a card nicknamed the Biscuit, are supposed to be carried with the president at all times. This isn't just protocol. It's apocalypse etiquette. If the world is ending, you need your receipt. But during a security check, someone opened the leather pouch and found nothing. Like a magician's trick gone wrong. The rabbit, the hat, the mushroom cloud, all missing. No alarms were raised at the time, no heads rolled. The missing biscuit quietly vanished into bureaucratic haze. Until later, when people started talking, retrospectively horrified. It's a uniquely American absurdity that the most powerful button in the world can disappear like a sock in the laundry. But before we had misplaced doom, we had misbehaving generals, like Ulysses S. Grant, who got himself arrested. Not for treason, for trotting. Ulysses S. Grant was once arrested for speeding, on a horse. It was D.C. in the 1870s. Cobblestone streets, gas lamps, top hats and whispers. And President Ulysses S. Grant, Civil War hero, commanding presence, sworn protector of law and order, was caught breaking it. Not in the shadows, not behind closed doors, but in broad daylight, for riding his horse too fast. The officer who pulled him over, a humble policeman named William H. West, warned the president one day. The next day, he caught him galloping again. This time, he issued a citation. Grant reportedly laughed, paid the fine, and told West he was doing his job. No motorcades, no sirens. Just a man, a horse, and a blur of hooves where law said trot. It's a story so mundane, it bends back into mythology. A president who won a war, ran the country, and still got booked like a reckless teen in a Camaro. Only slower and hairier. The moral isn't in the arrest. It's in the submission. Grant could have demanded immunity. Instead, he accepted the ticket. Which leads us to a different kind of skybound encounter. Because Ronald Reagan, he claimed to see something even the cavalry wouldn't chase. Ronald Reagan claimed to have seen a UFO while flying. Before he became the Gipper-in-Chief, before jelly beans, before the Hollywood grin hardened into a presidential mask, Ronald Reagan was flying in a small aircraft over California when he reportedly saw it. A strange light, unidentified, moving in ways that planes don't. He later told friends and pilots that it followed them, danced beside them, and then vanished. Reagan never gave interviews about it, but those close to him said he believed it, whatever it was. Of course, this was the Cold War. Paranoia was normal. Satellites were new. But Reagan's account had a calm eeriness, not a threat. Of it, something unexplainable hovering just above rationality, just below altitude. Years later, as president, he'd talk openly about how humanity might unite in the face of an alien threat. People laughed. But those who remembered the story of that quiet flight didn't laugh quite as hard. It begs the question, if a man who held the nuclear trigger believed in visitors, was he crazy or just honest? Because the only thing weirder than seeing aliens is banning pepper for safety. Zachary Taylor believed pepper was dangerous and banned it from all meals. Zachary Taylor, known as Old Rough and Ready, commanded troops with dust in his beard and grit in his voice. But draw a pepper shaker near his plate, and the man turned pale. To Taylor, black pepper wasn't just a spice. It was a threat. A culinary villain. Possibly fatal. He didn't merely avoid it, he banned it from White House meals altogether. Staff were instructed, chefs warned, dishes inspected. A presidential line drawn in the seasoning. Why? No one knows. Maybe an old battlefield superstition. Maybe a half-remembered folk remedy from his childhood in Kentucky. Or maybe it was the same logic that led to medical leeching and mercury tonics. If it burns, it must kill. The result? America's most powerful man eating like a 19th century toddler. Plain, pale, and cautious. A commander of men terrified of flavor. Ironically, it was food that killed him. A bowl of cherries and milk gone sour. Not pepper. Just time and bad refrigeration. Still, there's something oddly tragic about a man dodging imaginary assassins on his dinner plate, only to be undone by fruit. And while Taylor feared the spice rack, Harry Truman feared something far subtler. Accountability written on little slips of paper. Harry Truman would sometimes leave notes around the White House saying, "The buck still stops here. There's only one kind of ghost that haunts the White House worse than the spectral kind, the moral one." Harry Truman understood that. So he started leaving notes, tiny, typed or handwritten slips, placed on desks, tucked into drawers, sometimes just left in hallways. They all said the same thing. The buck still stops here. He didn't say it once. He said it over and over. Not to brag, not to perform, but as a kind of whispered dare to himself, to staff, to whoever would sit in that chair next. It was a phrase as sharp as any executive order. In an age of finger-pointing and plausible deniability, Truman kept reminding people, decisions are doors, and someone has to walk through them. And if you're president, that someone is you. They found the notes years later, folded, smudged, left behind like Post-it echoes. Maybe it was superstition. Maybe it was self-hypnosis. Or maybe Truman knew what every good illusionist knows. Say something often enough, and people believe it, even if you're trying to convince yourself. Because while Truman left behind mantras, Joe Biden left behind mirrors, cracked by practice, fogged with repetition. Joe Biden used to stutter so badly he practiced speeches in a mirror for hours, before the aviator shades, before the motorcades and memes. Joe Biden stood alone in front of a mirror, watching his own mouth fail him. Not once, not occasionally, but all the time. The syllables caught, the words jammed, the rhythm of a language broken like a skipping record. And every day he practiced. He wasn't rehearsing speeches for an audience. He was fighting his own voice, trying to wrestle coherence from a neurological stutter that mocked him with every vowel. He'd repeat lines over and over. Mark up note cards with slashes and cues. Pause, restart, pause again, sometimes for hours. He memorized the shapes his mouth made. He studied them like an actor learning to impersonate himself. And slowly, agonizingly, he learned to sound fluent. Not perfect, not polished, but passable. It wasn't confidence. It was survival. And when he later told children who stuttered, "I promise you it gets better," it didn't sound like comfort. It sounded like a warning disguised as hope. But not every scar is internal. Some are stitched in secret on a yacht in the middle of the sea, like Grover Cleveland, vanishing for surgery that didn't officially happen. Grover Cleveland secretly had a cancerous tumor removed on a yacht. Grover Cleveland vanished in the summer of 1893. Not for vacation, not for diplomacy. He boarded a friend's yacht, the Oneida, under the cover of a leisurely fishing trip. But instead of casting lines, a group of hand-picked doctors performed emergency surgery on the president's mouth. Cleveland had a tumor, malignant, fast-growing, right on the roof of his mouth, threatening not just his health, but the financial stability of the country. The nation was already panicking over the economy. A sick president might send it over the edge, so Cleveland ordered silence. The surgery was done on a moving boat under gaslight in secret. They removed part of his upper jaw and fitted him with a prosthetic to hide the damage. When he returned to the public eye, he smiled, gave speeches, smoked cigars. No one knew, not the press, not Congress, not even most of his staff. It wasn't revealed until years later. Even then, it sounded like a rumor, because it was just too strange to be true. The real story wasn't the tumor. It was how the president made the truth float away on a luxury vessel, like a lie on still water. Meanwhile, Rutherford B. Hayes wasn't hiding anything. He was thanking clouds. Rutherford B. Hayes wrote thank you notes to clouds in his journal. Rutherford B. Hayes, the quiet man who tiptoed into the presidency through one of the most disputed elections in U.S. history, spent his off hours writing thank you notes. Not to people, not to voters, to clouds. In his personal journal, between entries on policy and public appearances, Hayes left careful handwritten tributes to the sky. He'd praise a well-formed cumulus, applaud a sunset haze, express gratitude to a passing mist. His language was sincere, almost reverent. It wasn't a metaphor, it wasn't literary flair. He just really liked clouds. Maybe it was a coping mechanism, a way to soothe the ache of political compromise. Maybe it was the soul of a man too tender for the machinery he helmed. Or maybe Hayes just understood something most of us forget. Not everything has to be useful to be beautiful. Presidents are supposed to shape the nation. Hayes, in his own quiet rebellion, let the weather shape him. And while Hayes wrote to the heavens, Dwight D. Eisenhower stayed firmly grounded by golf balls and a panic button. Because nothing says leader of the free world like preparing for both birdies and Armageddon. Dwight D. Eisenhower installed a putting green at the White House and a secret panic button. Dwight D. Eisenhower didn't need metaphors. He needed control. So when he moved into the White House, he brought two things with him, a putting green and a panic button. Golf for clarity. Panic for, well, everything else. The putting green was installed just off the south lawn. Eisenhower used it obsessively. Not for leisure, but for strategy. The man approached his golf swing the way he approached military campaigns, with precision, patience, and no tolerance for disobedient divots. But then there was the other installation. Buried inside the architecture of calm was a hidden panic button, quiet, unseen, and meant to alert staff or summon security in an instant. The exact function? Unclear. The symbolism? Obvious. Behind every peaceful surface, Eisenhower believed, was the potential for crisis. So while he putted under cherry blossoms, his fingers could summon urgency with a tap. It was a president's version of prayer and preparation. Play the hole. Expect the bomb. Because some men keep their enemies close, others keep them under the floorboards. And speaking of secrets with wagging tails, Fala, the most famous presidential dog in history, was once accused of being a spy. Franklin Roosevelt's dog Fala was accused of espionage. Fala wasn't just a dog. He was an icon. A Scottish terrier with his own press agents, private railcar accommodations, and fan mail. He followed Franklin D. Roosevelt everywhere. Press briefings, diplomatic trips, wartime speeches. But in the strange theater of World War II politics, even Fala wasn't safe from suspicion. Rumors began to swirl. Some claimed Fala was a decoy. Others whispered that he was a wire-wearing spy, tail wagging his way into Allied war rooms. The theory that Fala had been trained, perhaps by British intelligence, perhaps by someone darker, to carry messages or record conversations, a dog with clearance. It was absurd, of course, but not funny absurd. Menacing absurd. The kind of accusation born out of paranoia so deep it would bark at its own reflection. Some even alleged Roosevelt had spent taxpayer dollars to retrieve the dog from a secret rescue mission in the Aleutian Islands, because obviously wartime logistics should revolve around terriers. Roosevelt eventually addressed the rumors in a speech, defending Fala's honor with the sharpest sarcasm of his presidency. The crowd roared. And yet, the fact remains, in a time when trust was scarce, even the president's best friend could be accused of treason. At least Fala didn't bleed on stage. That was Theodore Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt was shot mid-speech and finished the speech anyway. Milwaukee, 1912. A crowd waits. A man steps onto the platform. He's not a president anymore, but he is still a Roosevelt. He adjusts his spectacles, reaches into his coat. A gun fires, point blank. The bullet slams into his chest. Roosevelt staggers, but doesn't fall. Instead, he opens his coat and reveals that the bullet struck his folded speech manuscript, slowing its impact. Blood begins to bloom beneath his vest. He clears his throat and says, "It takes more than that to kill a bull moose." Then he speaks, for 90 minutes, while bleeding, while the bullet rests an inch from his lung. He finishes the speech, politely waves, and is finally convinced to go to the hospital. The doctors remove his shirt, examine the wound, and say what everyone was already thinking. This man is not human. He's legend in boots. But Roosevelt didn't do it for glory. He did it because the words had to be said, because conviction in his world was thicker than blood. Still, if Roosevelt's myth was built on volume and violence, James Monroe crafted his own from something stranger. Language. Or more specifically, removing it. James Monroe banned the word nice from his home, calling it a dead word. To James Monroe, language mattered. Not in the lofty, poetic way of Jefferson, or the combative clarity of Adams. No, Monroe was surgical about it, clinical. He didn't just speak, he curated speech. So when he declared the word nice unwelcome in his home, it wasn't a joke. It was doctrine. He called it a dead word, meaningless, diluted by overuse, a placeholder that said nothing, hinted at nothing, described nothing. To Monroe, calling something nice was intellectual cowardice. He'd rather someone say wretched, sublime, repugnant, exquisite, anything with sharp edges. Visitors were warned, children corrected, servants trained. In the Monroe household, blandness was treason. It sounds petty. Maybe it was. But there's something revealing in the act. A man trying to control reality by controlling vocabulary. If words shape thought, then maybe dull words dull the mind. Or maybe Monroe just really hated small talk. Whatever the case, he understood something our modern age has long since buried under emojis and pleasantries. Language can die from politeness. And speaking of eating polite things in impolite places, Barack Obama once consumed something that would make Monroe choke on his vocabulary. Dog, as a child. Barack Obama once ate dog meat in Indonesia as a child. Before the suits, the podiums, the Nobel, and the Saturday Night Live impersonations, Barack Obama was just a kid in Jakarta, half American, half Indonesian, by osmosis, learning how to blend into a culture he didn't yet understand. And like many children raised in unfamiliar places, he ate what was put in front of him. That included snake, grasshopper, and yes, dog. It wasn't rebellion. It wasn't cruelty. It was dinner. Indonesia in the 1970s didn't coddle children with dietary boundaries or Instagrammable ethics. What mattered was survival, tradition, and not asking too many questions. Years later, when Obama casually mentioned the meal in his memoir, the reaction was swift. Outrage, disbelief, mockery. as if childhood hunger should have come with a moral compass. But maybe that's what makes it stick. The idea that a future American president once stared down a piece of meat and didn't know, or didn't care, what it used to bark like. It's not monstrous. It's disorienting. A moment where culture, necessity, and fate collided in the form of a plate. And for those disturbed by this culinary confession, take comfort. The next president on our list had even more disturbing priorities, namely his sideburns. Martin Van Buren spent over an hour each day grooming his sideburns. If you've ever seen Martin Van Buren's face, and not many have, you've seen them. The sideburns. Massive, sweeping, aggressively styled tufts of facial hair that flared outward like a pair of startled cats clinging to his cheeks. They weren't just hair. They were policy. And Van Buren, 8th President of the United States, was their tireless caretaker. Every morning, the man reportedly devoted over an hour to grooming them. Combing, shaping, oiling, admiring. This wasn't vanity. It was identity. His nickname was the Little Magician, but the real illusion was how those sideburns never collapsed under their own ambition. While the country stumbled through economic depressions and the politics of slavery were beginning to boil, Van Buren stood in front of a mirror, tending to his whiskers, like a bonsai tree made of hair and hubris. The irony? The sideburns outlasted his reputation. Generations forgot his policies. Historians bicker about his effectiveness. But the burns? Unforgettable. Like wool epaulets for the soul. And yet, even a man as fastidious as Van Buren never anticipated the presidential embarrassment of the next guy, who didn't lose his dignity in a scandal, but in a splash. George H.W. Bush vomited on the Japanese prime minister during a state dinner. Diplomacy has its rituals, handshakes, toasts, smiles that don't reach the eyes. But on January 8, 1992, President George H.W. Bush added a new item to the list: vomiting on the Prime Minister of Japan. It happened during a formal banquet. Glittering chandeliers, polished speeches, the kind of stiff decorum where even a raised eyebrow can cause an incident. Bush, reportedly ill from a stomach virus, stood to deliver a toast and collapsed forward into his host's lap, unleashing an unholy torrent of presidential bile. Security lunged. Aides froze. Cameras rolled. The moment was broadcast worldwide. Japanese newspapers coined a verb for it. In the U.S., late-night shows had enough material for weeks. It wasn't treason. It wasn't a scandal. It was worse. It was deeply human, uncontrolled, humiliating, and forever attached to the man's legacy. For all his medals and titles, Bush had become the president who puked. But maybe that's the cosmic trait of the office. No matter how carefully you script the performance, your body still betrays you, always at the worst possible time. Just ask John Adams, whose method of self-discipline involved walking in literal circles for hours. John Adams walked in circles for hours as a form of self-discipline. John Adams believed in virtue like some men believe in gravity. It wasn't optional. It wasn't fun. It was law, etched in muscle, restraint, and sweat. So when he felt temptation, frustration, or the creeping weight of vanity, he punished it the only way he trusted, by walking. In circles for hours, not strolling, not reflecting, circling, like a stern ghost pacing the boundaries of his own ideals. Witnesses recalled him muttering to himself as he marched, phrases half in Latin, half in fury. He believed the body must obey the will, and the will must serve something higher than comfort. So he walked, until the urge to indulge dissolved into fatigue, until virtue, or at least exhaustion, returned. It wasn't exercise, it was exorcism. The second president of the United States, a man who helped draft the very bones of the Republic, spent entire afternoons tracing invisible loops across his property like a human compass stuck on punishment. And yet, for all his strict self-regulation, Adams couldn't control what happened after him. Because not every president rules alone. Some are ruled for. Just ask Woodrow Wilson, who technically had a second term. He just wasn't the one leading it. Woodrow Wilson's wife essentially ran the country for a year after his stroke. In 1919, Woodrow Wilson collapsed, body broken, speech slurred, face frozen. The President of the United States was no longer capable of functioning, let alone governing. But no one was told, not officially, not publicly. For over a year, the executive branch became a whisper network, run by his wife. Edith Wilson didn't take the oath. She never signed a single bill. But behind closed doors, she screened memos, reviewed legislation, and decided which matters deserved the president's attention. Translation: which ones she would handle herself. She called it stewardship. Others called it a soft coup. The cabinet was kept in the dark. Congress fumed. The public? Blissfully unaware. The man elected to lead had become a ghost in his own house, while Edith typed, scheduled, filtered, and ruled. She insisted it wasn't power, just duty, just love, just a necessary fiction. But history doesn't care about marital devotion when governance is being ghostwritten. And when you realize how easy it was to hide a president's collapse, Jefferson's quiet editing of the divine doesn't feel so bold after all. It feels inevitable. Thomas Jefferson rewrote the Bible, removing all miracles. Thomas Jefferson sat with a razor, a glue pot, and several Bibles, not to read them, to dismantle them. He cut, carefully, deliberately, stripping away every miracle, every mention of divine magic. No virgin births, no resurrection, no walking on water, just parables, philosophy, a self-contained moral code extracted from what he saw as centuries of superstition. He called it the life and morals of Jesus of Nazareth. But what he really created was a spiritual audit. Jesus, not as savior, but sage. A man, not a god. His hands didn't glow. They healed through logic and compassion. His power wasn't celestial. It was practical. Jefferson didn't publish it. He didn't preach it. He kept it to himself, tucked away like a secret diary of disbelief. Because even a founding father had to tiptoe through theology when shaping a nation built on both liberty and scripture. What he left behind was less a Bible and more a mirror, reflecting the mind of a man who loved enlightenment more than epiphany. And yet, while Jefferson edited divinity out of holy books, Ronald Reagan was watching musicals, searching for something miraculous in the sound of music. Ronald Reagan watched The Sound of Music dozens of times, calling it emotional preparation. Ronald Reagan, actor turned governor turned president, believed in narrative. Not the messy kind with nuance and contradiction, but the clean, sweeping kind with mountains, music, and a well-timed key change. Which might explain why he watched The Sound of Music not once, not twice, but dozens of times. Alone. Repeatedly. He called it emotional preparation. For what exactly? No one was quite sure. The story of a nun who sings her way into a military family during the rise of Nazi Germany isn't the most obvious prelude to Cold War diplomacy. But Reagan saw something in it. Maybe it was the simplicity of good versus evil. Maybe it was the resolve of a song drowning out marching boots. Or maybe, just maybe, it was the one place where the world still made moral sense. He didn't cry. He didn't clap. He simply watched, again and again, like a general studying battle footage. There's something surreal about imagining the President of the United States getting ready to address the nation by first listening to Julie Andrews twirl in an alpine field. And if that's how he found clarity, so be it. Meanwhile, clarity for Millard Fillmore required something far more obscure. Peeling apples in exactly the right direction. Millard Fillmore refused to eat apples unless peeled counterclockwise. In a nation obsessed with freedom, Millard Fillmore clung to one very specific rule. Apples must be peeled counterclockwise, not diagonally. Not however the knife felt. Counterclockwise every time. Or he wouldn't eat them. This wasn't a culinary preference. It was a ritual. A rule written in invisible ink somewhere between obsession and superstition. White House staff reportedly learned this fast. One wrong spiral of the knife, and Fillmore would wave the apple away like an ambassador bearing bad news. Why counterclockwise? No one knows. Maybe it was about control. Maybe it was about order. Maybe the direction mattered less than the fact of the rule. The universe reduced to a fruit and a blade, and a man who needed something predictable. Fillmore didn't leave much behind. No major wars, no revolutionary doctrines. But he did leave a mental image. The President of the United States frowning at fruit, measuring morality by peel direction. And if Fillmore searched for omens in apples, Jimmy Carter went looking for them in the stars. Or more precisely, in the sky, one night in 1973, when something very unpresidential flew past his reality. Jimmy Carter filed a UFO sighting report in 1973. It wasn't a joke. It wasn't a PR stunt. Long before the Oval Office and Habitat for Humanity, Jimmy Carter stood in the night with several others and watched something strange hover in the Georgia sky. Silent, bright, unmoving. Then, gone. He never called it an alien. He never claimed contact. But the experience stayed with him, unsettling and unresolved. So he did what honest men do when they see something they can't explain. He filed a report. In 1973, Carter officially documented the sighting with the International UFO Bureau, a future president submitting paperwork to the paranormal. He would later clarify he didn't believe it was a spaceship, probably a military aircraft or some natural phenomenon. But the fact that he took it seriously says something deeper. Not about aliens, about humility. Because it takes a certain kind of mind to say, I saw something. I don't know what it was. And that matters. Not every leader needs certainty. Some just need honesty. And some, like Herbert Hoover, just needed a language no one else in the room could understand. Herbert Hoover and his wife spoke Mandarin Chinese to keep staff from understanding them. Before he was blamed for breadlines and banking collapses, Herbert Hoover was an engineer, and a global one. He traveled the world with blueprints in one hand and moral certainty in the other. Somewhere along the journey, he picked up Mandarin Chinese. His wife Lou did too. They didn't just dabble, they spoke it fluently. At home, in the White House. When they wanted privacy, they switched to Mandarin. Mid-conversation, mid-room, mid-sentence. Staff would freeze, ears strained, but nothing made sense. It was an invisible wall, one made of tones, characters, and social distance. It wasn't just privacy. It was power. In a house where everyone's job is to overhear you, the ability to hide behind a foreign tongue becomes a kind of luxury. Or maybe a quiet rebellion. Imagine eavesdropping on a presidential couple only to realize you're linguistically uninvited. Some historians say it was cute. Others say it was controlling. Either way, it worked. The most powerful couple in the world spoke in code, because sometimes secrets aren't whispered. They're just translated. And while Hoover encrypted intimacy with language, Lyndon B. Johnson had his own kind of privacy, delivered at full blast through a custom-engineered wall of water. Lyndon B. Johnson had a custom-made shower with multiple jets from all angles. Lyndon B. Johnson didn't bathe. He conquered water. His White House shower wasn't a fixture, it was a hydrological weapon. Specially designed, retrofitted with nozzles from every possible angle, it unleashed torrents so aggressive they reportedly peeled skin. It sprayed from above, below, front, back, and flanks. He called it invigorating. Staff called it concerning. LBJ gave engineers meticulous, occasionally furious instructions. He demanded that the jets blast right at my belly button, and that no part of him, no part, be left untouched by water. The man wanted immersion that bordered on obliteration. It wasn't just hygiene. It was ritual, therapy, power demonstration. A daily hydro purge that prepared him to bark orders and debate policy with the subtlety of a hurricane. Some aides heard him yell through the pipes, lectures on Vietnam, tax reform, personal grudges, echoing through marble like Zeus and mid-lather. Because if you control how water touches you, maybe you control everything. And yet, for all his bravado, Johnson feared nothing as much as being forgotten. A fear that George Washington, eerily enough, turned inside out into a chilling obsession with not being buried alive. George Washington feared being buried alive and ordered a 3-day wake. The man who couldn't tell a lie could not, for the life of him, shake a terrifying truth. He might be declared dead too soon. George Washington feared premature burial with a kind of morbid logic that only someone born in the 18th century could truly understand. In those days, medicine was more guess than guarantee. People woke up in coffins. Or didn't. So Washington made it clear, explicitly clear, in his final instructions. After he died, his body must not be touched, moved, or interred for 3 full days. No embalming, no crypt, no last rites, just a corpse on standby. For 72 hours, America's founding body lay in cold silence, just in case it decided to sit up and clear its throat. Some say it was rational caution. Others say it was superstition. Either way, it paints a strange image. The first president of the United States encased in velvet, being watched by candlelight and dread. A general who feared no war, but trembled at the idea of waking up underground. And while Washington feared darkness too soon, Richard Nixon found comfort in the strange spotlight of a piano performance, broadcast across the nation. Richard Nixon played piano on national television. Richard Nixon was not known for charm. He was not known for grace. He was not known for doing things that made people like him. But one evening, on national television, he sat down at a piano and played. Live. No smoke, no mirrors, just Nixon, in a suit, hunched over the keys like a lounge act trapped inside a political crisis. It was the Jack Paar program, and the performance was oddly tender, strangely competent, and deeply unsettling. He played a piece he'd composed himself, moody, slow, almost romantic. It didn't scream politics. It whispered something else. Look, I'm not just the sweating man behind the curtain. I'm human. I feel things too. It worked. Sort of. The audience clapped awkwardly. The moment faded. But the image stayed. Nixon, whose voice made enemies, using a piano to say what he couldn't, with words. For a minute, the most guarded man in America opened himself. Not through confession, but through chords. And if Nixon tried to redeem himself through music, Abraham Lincoln had no such illusions. He knew how his story ended, because he saw it in a dream. Abraham Lincoln dreamed of his own assassination days before it happened. It was April. The war was winding down. The Capitol breathed a cautious exhale, and Abraham Lincoln went to sleep. In the dream, he walked through the White House silent. Empty hallways, draped curtains, the echo of his own footsteps, then murmurs, sobbing, a casket, guards. Who is dead in the White House, he asked. The president, someone whispered. He woke up, shaken, told his wife, told his friends, laughed it off, but didn't forget it. Days later, he sat in Ford's Theater, watching a comedy, laughing until the shot, until the curtain call he had already imagined. Lincoln didn't believe in omens, not publicly, but privately he carried the weight of every death in that war. Maybe he thought his own would balance the scale. Maybe he thought his dream wasn't prophecy. It was penance. Either way, it came true. And while Lincoln dreamt of death, Calvin Coolidge preferred simpler comforts, head rubs, petroleum jelly, and the kind of morning routine that feels like satire. Calvin Coolidge liked having his head rubbed with petroleum jelly while eating breakfast in bed. Imagine the stillest president in history lying in bed beneath a mountain of white sheets. It's morning. The sun creeps in. A servant enters with a tray, eggs, toast, juice. And behind him, another servant, holding a jar of petroleum jelly. Coolidge, motionless, expressionless, begins his breakfast. And as he chews, the second servant begins gently massaging his scalp. No questions, no conversation, just rhythmic, glistening strokes of jelly on a president's bare skull. This was not a one-time indulgence. It was routine, codified, presidential. No one really knows why he liked it. Some say it helped his hair, what little remained. Others claim it relaxed him before the burden of doing. Very little. Coolidge was famously inactive. But this he had energy for. It's both absurd and strangely poetic. A man who avoided drama, avoided conflict, avoided words, reduced his mornings to texture and silence, breakfast and lubrication, command and stillness. He ruled like a ghost, but he moisturized like a king. And speaking of secrets written in invisible ink, James Madison wasn't just scribbling history. He was hiding it. Even when there was nothing to hide, James Madison wrote messages in invisible ink, even when it wasn't necessary. In the early days of the Republic, paranoia wasn't a vice, it was protocol. James Madison, architect of the Constitution and a man with more words per square inch in his brain than most dictionaries, took secrecy to strange places, specifically, invisible ink. He used it often, and not just for war dispatches or classified dealings. He used it for casual notes, personal correspondence, journal entries that no one else was ever meant to see. He'd dip his pen in the special ink, write, and leave behind blank pages, visible only under certain chemicals or heat. It was a magic trick with no audience. Why? No one's sure. Maybe it was habit. Maybe it was the thrill. Or maybe Madison, stooped, scholarly, consumed with structure, just preferred the idea that his thoughts might never be seen unless someone really earned them. He built a government on transparency and then buried his own thoughts behind chemical walls. Because nothing says father of the Constitution like ghostwriting your grocery list in secret code. Still, Madison's fears were quaint compared to the next mystery, one that involved wind, storms, and the theoretical detonation of a nuclear warhead. Donald Trump once suggested nuking hurricanes. Let that sentence sit for a moment. Not satire, not exaggeration. Just a reported conversation. Donald Trump, during a hurricane briefing, floated the idea of launching nuclear weapons into hurricanes, to disrupt them, to neutralize the threat. The room went silent. Scientists blinked. Aides scribbled notes in disbelief. It wasn't a joke. He was serious. There is, to be fair, a strange internal logic to it. Large problem, large solution. What could be more American? But the physics? Catastrophic. Nuking a hurricane doesn't dissipate it. It irradiates the ocean and vaporizes weather. The storm doesn't stop. It becomes history's first airborne radioactive blender. Still, the idea was proposed, not acted on, not followed through, but proposed, out loud, in a room full of adults. What lingers isn't the science. It's the fact that the most powerful man in the world looked at a natural disaster and thought, what if we just obliterate it? And while Trump imagined storms bowing to bombs, Benjamin Harrison couldn't even face the light switch, because electricity to him was sorcery with wires. Benjamin Harrison was so scared of electricity he wouldn't touch light switches. Benjamin Harrison, 23rd President of the United States, governed during the rise of modern technology. But he wanted no part of it, especially electricity. The White House had just been wired. It was cutting edge. Bulbs glowed, switches clicked. But Harrison refused to touch them. He was convinced the electrical current would leap out and kill him. Literally, if he needed a room lit, he called a servant. He would walk through the halls at night in the dark, rather than risk flipping a switch. The very thing meant to bring light and convenience became to Harrison a flickering death trap. There's something strangely relatable in that. A man standing in the seat of power, terrified by a simple panel on the wall. You can author foreign policy and military strategy, but the hallway light? That's where you draw the line. He didn't trust what he couldn't see. And electricity? It was silent, invisible, and waiting. Of course, Thomas Jefferson didn't avoid the gaze of others. He avoided making it at all. Because eye contact, to him, was far more dangerous than any socket. Thomas Jefferson avoided eye contact so intensely, it made others uncomfortable. Thomas Jefferson could debate Locke, translate Homer, and design neoclassical architecture before breakfast. But stare into your eyes? Absolutely not. He avoided eye contact with such intensity, so methodically, that it began to unnerve people. He wasn't shy. He wasn't unsure. He just found direct gazes invasive, distracting, unnecessary. A form of communication beneath him, perhaps. One that revealed too much. Visitors would speak to him and watch his eyes drift to corners, floorboards, ceilings. Some thought he was rude. Others thought he was somewhere else entirely. A mind orbiting enlightenment philosophy, while the body politely nodded. He was a president of distance, between ideas and action, between people and principles, between eyes and truth. To look someone in the eye is to risk being read. Jefferson built walls with his glance. Elegant, intellectual walls, coated in reason, hollow with avoidance. And while Jefferson fled the intimacy of a stare, Joe Biden spent his early years trapped inside his own voice, forced to rehearse every syllable like a man diffusing a bomb in his mouth. Twice, his brain would almost betray him completely. Joe Biden had 2 brain aneurysms surgically repaired in the 1980s. In 1988, Joe Biden collapsed. Headache, disorientation. Then a diagnosis, brain aneurysm, then another. 2 separate bulges in blood vessels pressing silently against the mind of a man who made his living with words. They could burst at any moment. And they almost did. He underwent emergency surgery twice. Scalp peeled, skull opened, vessels stitched. He nearly died both times. Not political setback died, actual death, the quiet kind, where legacies stop and epilogues begin. Recovery was long and grueling. He couldn't speak clearly. He couldn't remember things. His body wouldn't obey his ambition. But he came back. Not with a roar, but with a whisper that built itself back into volume. Most politicians hide illness behind spin. Biden had no choice but to bleed publicly. The scars were invisible, but the vulnerability wasn't. It followed him, quietly, stubbornly, as if his own brain had once tried to impeach him from the inside. And yet, as he re-entered politics, people still joked about his gaffes. Few knew how close he came to losing the ability to say anything at all. Which brings us to a different kind of confinement, the physical, porcelain kind. William Howard Taft didn't almost die. He just couldn't get out of the tub. William Howard Taft got stuck in the White House bathtub and had a custom one made. William Howard Taft, the largest man to ever hold the presidency, weighed in at over 300 pounds. The White House bathtubs, designed for standard-sized statesmen, didn't stand a chance. One day, after settling in for a soak, Taft reportedly discovered he couldn't get back out. Trapped, slippery, helpless. A man whose signature could send troops abroad now required assistance from multiple aides just to escape his own bathroom. The moment became legend, whispered by staffers and quietly acknowledged by history. Taft didn't deny it. Instead, he responded in peak Taft fashion, with logistics. He had a custom bathtub installed, 7 feet long, over 3 feet wide, built for girth and dignity. 4 grown men could reportedly fit inside it, comfortably. It was practical. It was inevitable. It was also a metaphor, because Taft's presidency was defined by being wedged between opposing forces, unable to move, needing others to lift him out. And while his bathtub became the punchline, it also became a monument to physical reality. A reminder that the body in the end always has a say. Sometimes, though, the threats aren't physical. Sometimes they come in the form of a salty snack during a football game and a brush with presidential mortality. George W. Bush once nearly choked on a pretzel watching football. It was supposed to be a normal evening. Just the President of the United States, a television, a football game, and a bowl of pretzels. But mid-snack, George W. Bush leaned back, swallowed wrong, and the pretzel fought back. Hard. He blacked out, collapsed, bruised his face on the floor. Secret Service panicked. Doctors arrived. Diagnosis? Snack-related near-death experience. It sounds absurd, and it is. But it also happened. One breath the wrong way, and the commander-in-chief was downed not by war or scandal, but by a twist of salted dough. In interviews afterward, Bush laughed about it. spun it into a metaphor for humility. But the truth lingers. Even the most powerful man on earth can be taken out by junk food during a commercial break. That night, the nuclear football sat nearby, guarded and untouched. Meanwhile, the real crisis involved Heimlich maneuvers and maybe a second bowl of snacks. It's almost poetic. A man leading a global superpower, defeated by his own airway. Mortality has never tasted so processed. But if Bush faced danger through his trachea, Andrew Jackson chose to face it head-on by installing literal firepower aimed directly at his own bed. Andrew Jackson installed a cannon facing his bedroom. Andrew Jackson didn't trust many things, banks, courts, or the idea that peace was ever permanent, which is probably why he had a cannon installed, facing his own bedroom window, not the garden, not the lawn, the bedroom. The logic? Unknown. The message? Loud. Some say it was symbolic, a show of force, an iron reminder that vigilance never sleeps. Others speculate it was defensive in case of a direct assault. But the placement is too bizarre to ignore. Either he expected an ambush from his flower beds, or he wanted to wake up every morning and remember, life is war. Jackson, who fought in over 100 duels and carried bullets in his body like souvenirs, didn't just decorate with danger. He slept next to it. The cannon loomed outside like a loyal watchdog made of iron and paranoia. And still, the question remains, what exactly did he think was coming through that window? If Jackson armed his home like a battlefield, Bill Clinton ran his from a hotel suite. Because the next military action didn't come from the Situation Room. It came from room service and a dial tone in Brussels. Bill Clinton sent troops into battle from a hotel room in Brussels. In 1999, NATO launched airstrikes over Kosovo. And the order to begin came not from the White House, not from a war room buried beneath reinforced concrete, but from a hotel room in Brussels, where President Bill Clinton sat in a robe on the phone. The scene is surreal. Minibar, cable TV, maybe a folded towel shaped like a swan, and the president authorizing military force. In slippers. This wasn't negligence, it was logistics. He was on a diplomatic trip. The timing was tight. The decision had to be made. But still, the absurdity lingers. Wars started not with bugles or battle cries, but with long-distance calls and scratchy room service menus. There's a strange intimacy in that image. Global consequences launched from the same place someone else might order breakfast. It's a reminder that power isn't always dramatic. Sometimes it's quiet, casual, pajama-clad. And if that doesn't unsettle you, consider what John Quincy Adams believed was controlling human behavior. Not geopolitics, not personal will, but the moon. John Quincy Adams believed the moon influenced human behavior more than gravity. John Quincy Adams, a man fluent in multiple languages, prone to skinny dipping in the Potomac at dawn, and capable of arguing constitutional nuance while writing poetry, firmly believed the moon shaped human behavior more than gravity ever could. This wasn't metaphor. He thought lunar cycles affected temperament, mood, even destiny. To him, the moon wasn't just a celestial body. It was a personality machine in the sky, turning knobs on mankind's emotions like some silent, glowing therapist. He spent time pondering it, writing about it, quoting ancient philosophers and blending science with folklore. Not because he was ignorant. On the contrary, Adams was possibly the most intellectually overclocked president to ever take office. That's what makes it so strange. The same mind that debated treaties with razor precision also believed that the moon might be making you impulsive on a Tuesday. It's the kind of contradiction that lingers. One foot in enlightenment, the other in enchantment. And while Adams looked to the moon for insight, Barack Obama once looked up from a sidewalk and realized someone thought he worked there. Because sometimes the universe doesn't need celestial manipulation to embarrass you. Just one rich guy and a valet ticket. Barack Obama once got mistaken for a valet and took someone's keys. Before the presidency. Before the arena speeches. Before the carefully rolled up sleeves and calibrated charisma. Barack Obama was just another young man in a nice suit. standing outside a fancy event. And then someone handed him their car keys. They didn't say much, just assumed. The combination of skin tone, location, and attire made the math simple. Clearly, he must be the valet. Obama, amused and slightly stunned, took the keys. He later told the story with his trademark smirk, a chuckle that didn't quite hide the sting. Because that's what the moment really was, not a joke, but a slap, a reminder, a man on the road to becoming the most powerful figure in the world, mistaken for someone paid to fetch sedans. He didn't make a scene. He didn't correct them with a thunderclap. He just handed the keys back and walked on. Because sometimes the best revenge isn't a confrontation. It's history. And while Obama absorbed insult with grace, George Washington responded to injustice by distilling his own power into barrels of frontier whiskey. George Washington brewed his own whiskey. Yes, that George Washington, the marble-chinned father of the Republic, the man who conquered frostbite and monarchy alike, was also one of the largest whiskey producers in early America. At Mount Vernon, long after the battles were fought and the Constitution inked, Washington turned to distillation. He built a full-scale operation, hired skilled workers, produced gallons upon gallons of the good stuff, rye, corn, malted barley, the kind that warms your throat and sets your ears humming. By 1799, his distillery was among the most successful in the nation. It wasn't a side hobby. It was strategy. He understood early what most presidents learn too late. Politics is temporary, but liquor is eternal. Washington's whiskey was practical patriotism, liquid enterprise, a reminder that independence doesn't stop at borders. It bubbles up through copper stills and gets bottled in dark glass. You can almost see him there, sleeves rolled, watching the steam rise, tasting the first sip like it held the blueprint of a new republic. And while Washington found clarity in fermentation, Franklin Pierce whispered his confessions to a horse. Franklin Pierce whispered to his horse during arguments. Franklin Pierce, the 14th President of the United States and a man so forgettable he nearly disappeared into the margins of his own history, had one deeply specific quirk. During heated arguments, cabinet disputes, political debates, emotional breakdowns, he would quietly leave the room and whisper to his horse. Not metaphorically, not in some pastoral retreat years later. Right there, in the stables behind the White House. Pierce was known for his charm and his drinking, but his emotional coping mechanism was straight out of a Gothic novel. When frustrated, angry, or just inconsolably sad, which reportedly was often, he'd retreat to the stables, find his horse, and begin talking in low, soothing tones. Confessions, frustrations, policy complaints, all murmured into the ear of a creature that could neither judge nor interrupt. His aides pretended not to notice. His opponents had no idea. His horse, stoic. It wasn't therapy. It wasn't strategy. It was something stranger. Maybe the only relationship Pierce ever fully trusted. And if Pierce found solace in hooves and hay, Gerald Ford found only gravity. Or rather, its total indifference, especially on the stairs of Air Force One. Gerald Ford fell down Air Force One stairs twice. There are ways to make an entrance as President of the United States. A salute, a wave, a brisk walk down the stairs of Air Force One. Gerald Ford chose the somersault twice. On two separate occasions, Ford, the only president never elected to either the presidency or vice presidency, stumbled catastrophically down the plane steps. Cameras caught it. Replay loops celebrated it. Comedians made a cottage industry out of it. To be fair, Ford was an athlete, a college football star with knees that had taken enough hits to justify the occasional gravitational betrayal. But that didn't stop the narrative. Overnight, the image of Ford transformed. Not elder statesman, but slapstick uncle. He laughed it off, but the bruises and the perception stuck. The irony? He was one of the most physically fit presidents in history. But the world doesn't remember your stats. It remembers your stumbles. And speaking of unforgettable legacies, John Tyler didn't trip over steps. He tripped over biology, again and again and again, until he fathered 15 children. John Tyler had more children than any other president, 15 in total. John Tyler, 10th President of the United States, spent his post-presidency building a legacy, not in libraries or monuments, but in offspring. 15 children. Officially, possibly more unofficially. The man didn't just leave a political mark. He left a bloodline, 2 wives. The first bore 8 children. The second, a woman 30 years his junior, bore 7 more. The age gap was enough to make headlines then, and would spark lawsuits today. Tyler had kids born before the invention of the telegraph, and others who lived to see television. He personally fathered a bridge between centuries. In fact, for years his grandchildren were still alive, serving as living proof that 19th century presidents could reach into the 21st century through sheer reproductive ambition. White House staff joked that the only branch of government Tyler truly expanded was the family tree. Others speculated he was simply trying to repopulate Virginia. It's not just trivia, it's a strange reminder. Power doesn't always echo in law. Sometimes it echoes in genetics. But if Tyler's legacy was scattered across cribs and cradles, Joe Biden's came spinning on one machine in his home, the first of its kind in presidential history, a Peloton. Joe Biden is the first president with a Peloton bike. Joe Biden, known for his aviator shades, Amtrak loyalty, and nostalgic decency, also holds a more modern, sweatier distinction. He's the first sitting president with a Peloton bike in the White House. Yes, that Peloton. The high-end stationary bike with an HD screen, live classes, and motivational instructors yelling encouragement like caffeinated prophets. At first glance, it's a harmless detail, a bit of lifestyle trivia. But the implications are weirdly telling. Presidents have long had physical quirks. Lincoln's midnight walks, Taft's custom tubs. But Biden rides with earbuds in, guided by a perky stranger named Cody. Security officials were reportedly concerned. The Wi-Fi connection, the built-in camera, the potential for cyber intrusion. Imagine a foreign adversary hacking into a spin class and catching classified grunts in the background. So the bike had to be modified, silenced, scrubbed of its digital curiosity. What remains is a peculiar image. The leader of the free world pedaling furiously, privately, to nowhere, sweating out the weight of the office while being told to push harder by someone wearing neon in New York. And while Biden's ritual requires Bluetooth, Thomas Jefferson needed only cold water and bare feet. Thomas Jefferson soaked his feet in cold water every morning for health. He believed in moderation, in fresh air, in agrarian virtue, but above all, Thomas Jefferson believed in cold water. Specifically, soaking his feet in it, every morning, without fail, no matter the season. Why? To stimulate circulation, to strengthen the body, to harden the soul. It sounds quaint now, but to Jefferson, it was as essential as writing or farming or silently avoiding eye contact. This wasn't vanity. It was ritual, a daily baptism in discomfort, as if the chill of the water could prepare him for the chill of the world. He never wore socks indoors. He trusted no doctor completely, but he trusted that 10 freezing toes in a basin of Virginia well water could fend off disease, fatigue, and moral decay. Servants witnessed it. Guests ignored it. Jefferson, legs crossed, water lapping at his ankles, mind drifting toward classical virtue and probably moose carcasses. In his mind, this was enlightenment, the body disciplined into harmony with the natural world. Meanwhile, for Franklin D. Roosevelt's son, enlightenment came not from philosophy, but from fortunes, or rather fake ones. Franklin D. Roosevelt's son was investigated for running a fake fortune-telling ring. Amid the chaos of the Great Depression, the White House was juggling policy, war plans, and economic collapse. And quietly, in the periphery, President Franklin D. Roosevelt's son was being investigated for operating a fraudulent fortune-telling ring. Yes, a presidential heir dabbling in clairvoyance. The scheme involved questionable psychics, whispered predictions, and allegedly a fair amount of money changing hands. Patrons came seeking insight. They got theatrics. And behind the curtain, one of the Roosevelt boys orchestrating mysticism for profit. It was equal parts scandal and sideshow. Investigators sniffed around, questions were asked. But in classic Rooseveltian fashion, the family smoothed it over with enough charm to disarm a firing squad. The real mystery isn't the scam, it's the motive. Was it a joke taken too far? A rebellion against presidential pressure? Or did he genuinely believe in the power of a good crystal ball and a poker face? In a family full of titans and true believers, maybe a little fraud felt like freedom. And while Roosevelt's son faked glimpses of the future, James Garfield had no such need. His brain could split time and language right down the middle. James Garfield could write Greek with one hand and Latin with the other, simultaneously. James A. Garfield didn't just study language, he performed it. One of the strangest and most underappreciated feats in presidential lore is that Garfield, with effortless flair, could write in Greek with one hand and Latin with the other, at the same time. That's not metaphor. That's not a party trick. That's a neurological flex few humans on Earth could replicate. He'd take two pens, position his hands like a symphony conductor about to split the universe, and begin. Left hand flowing Greek script, right hand stately Latin, simultaneously in mirror symmetry. It wasn't about showing off. Well, maybe a little. But for Garfield, it was meditation. A way to wrestle with chaos using order and syntax. A dual devotion to classical beauty and disciplined absurdity. He never bragged about it on the campaign trail. He didn't tweet it out. He just did it. Then he got shot 4 months into his term. The man could divide his brain like a scholar, but couldn't dodge a bullet in a train station. That's the paradox. And speaking of paradoxes, Theodore Roosevelt, the ultimate intellectual bruiser, didn't just memorize everything. He fought everything, including his staff, with gloves on. Theodore Roosevelt had a photographic memory and boxed in the White House. Theodore Roosevelt didn't just read books. He inhaled them. Word for word, line by line, seared into his mind. A photographic memory so precise, aides once swore he could quote entire paragraphs from obscure 15th century military treaties he'd read once, in Greek. But intellectualism was only half the package. The other half wore gloves. Roosevelt converted a White House room into a personal boxing ring, not as decoration, as a full-contact reality. Staffers, friends, military officers, if you were near him long enough, you might get challenged to a friendly bout. Friendly, meaning prepare to get punched by the president. He didn't pull punches either. One blow left him partially blind in one eye. He kept boxing anyway. This was TR in a nutshell. Memorize an encyclopedia in the morning, break your nose by lunch. Speak softly, sure, but only after you've rearranged someone's jaw. He believed a sharp mind belonged in a strong body, that governance should be tested not just by policy, but by uppercut. And while Roosevelt fought with fists, Jimmy Carter once fought something far stranger. A swimming rabbit with murder in its eyes. Jimmy Carter was once attacked by a swimming killer rabbit. It sounds fake, like a rejected Onion headline. But in 1979, President Jimmy Carter, former Navy man, peanut farmer, devout Christian, was fishing alone in a boat in Georgia when a large swamp rabbit swam directly at him, frothing, determined. It paddled across the water with unnatural speed, eyes locked, teeth bared, ears flat like wings of vengeance. Carter, startled and unsure whether he was hallucinating, grabbed a paddle and tried to splash the creature away. It didn't retreat. Staff later dubbed it the killer rabbit. Carter insisted it was real. The press mocked him anyway. Because nothing says leader of the free world like being nearly mauled by a bunny in open water. A photo was taken. It circulated. The incident haunted Carter's reputation with absurdity. But the real irony? Carter had survived Cold War standoffs and Southern political gauntlets, only to be publicly outmaneuvered by a damp rodent with a grudge. You can plan for everything, until the rabbit swims. And if Carter faced terror and fur, George H.W. Bush faced his own skyward fears by leaping into them at 90 years old. George H.W. Bush celebrated his 90th birthday by skydiving. At an age when most men celebrate birthdays with cake, naps, and maybe a quiet brunch, George H.W. Bush decided to fling himself out of an airplane. Not once. Not as a joke, but as a tradition. And on his 90th birthday, strapped to a Navy SEAL, the 41st President of the United States skydived. Again. He'd done it before. Once to mark the end of his presidency. Then again at 75. Then 80. Then 85. And finally at 90, he was back in the sky. White hair whipping in the wind. Free-falling into legacy. Why? His answer was always the same. Because he could. It wasn't a midlife crisis. It was a late-life exclamation point. A reminder that the body may weaken, but the will doesn't have to. That aging doesn't mean fading. That falling can be chosen. Staffers tried to dissuade him. His doctors winced. The public held its breath. He landed, smiling. If you want a metaphor for presidential defiance, look no further than a nonagenarian leaping into a blue sky with dignity flapping behind him like a parachute. And while Bush defied gravity, James Buchanan tried to outwit deception with a sneeze. James Buchanan believed sneezing expelled lies. James Buchanan, the only lifelong bachelor to occupy the White House, harbored a belief that would have made ancient physicians proud and modern therapists wince. He thought sneezing expelled lies. Not metaphorically, not symbolically, literally. He believed the act of sneezing purged dishonesty from the body, like a moral reset button hidden in the sinuses. A good sneeze to Buchanan wasn't a nuisance, it was purification. He sneezed often, loudly, dramatically, and after each one he'd pause, clear his throat, and behave as though some moral toxin had just been released into the air. Aides weren't sure what to make of it. Diplomats whispered about it. Was he sick or just recalibrating? Perhaps it was an elaborate deflection, a Victorian attempt at emotional hygiene, or perhaps Buchanan, trapped in the static expectations of pre-Civil War politics, needed some part of the body to be honest, even if it was just the nose. In any case, truth never had such awkward acoustics. And while Buchanan chased honesty through tissues, John F. Kennedy kept his truth preserved in the most unlikely of presidential souvenirs, a coconut shell. John F. Kennedy kept a coconut from his Wogyubutu rescue on his desk. John F. Kennedy, forever frozen in the collective memory as youth and myth, once commanded a torpedo boat in the Pacific. When it was rammed and destroyed by a Japanese destroyer, he didn't panic. He didn't surrender. He swam for hours, hauling an injured crew member by clenching the man's life jacket strap in his teeth. He led his crew to a nearby island. No radio, no rescue, just sand and fear. To summon help, Kennedy carved a message into a coconut shell. Noro ISL, Commander. Native knows posit. He can pilot. 11 alive. He gave it to local islanders, who smuggled it to Allied forces. They were saved. Years later, that same coconut, hollowed, scorched, scarred, sat on his desk in the Oval Office, encased in glass. Not a trophy, a reminder. Not of power, but of fragility, of chance, of what it meant to survive. It sat there while he made jokes, passed laws, and stared down nuclear standoffs, a shriveled, sun-bleached reminder that every speech, every flashbulb, every applause line was paid for in waterlogged endurance and a desperate scratch on a shell. And the man who fought through hell kept that hell right next to his pen. Just in case he ever forgot who he really was, the next man on our list fought just as fiercely, but mostly over insults to his wife. And with pistols. Andrew Jackson fought over 100 duels, mostly over insults to his wife. Andrew Jackson didn't just take things personally, he took them to the field. The man dueled over land, politics, honor, and above all else, his wife, Rachel. He fought over 100 duels in his lifetime. Yes, 100. That's not a metaphor for being argumentative. That's literally pacing 10 steps turning and shooting at a man because he said something unflattering. The insults about Rachel weren't casual. She had married Jackson while still legally, though unknowingly, wed to another man. The whispers followed them. Jackson heard every one and answered them with gunpowder. He was shot multiple times, in the chest, in the arm. At least one bullet stayed lodged in his body for decades, but he kept going. A thin, angular man, practically vibrating with rage and frontier etiquette, demanding satisfaction for every perceived slight. It wasn't bravado. It was policy. One famous duel with Charles Dickinson ended with Jackson getting shot, then calmly taking aim, adjusting his stance, and killing his opponent, without flinching. To Jackson, honor was more than abstract. It bled, it bruised, it fired back. And if Jackson was powered by vengeance, George W. Bush once fueled a presidency with something even stranger, the firm conviction that he, and only he, was the decider. George W. Bush once declared, "I'm the decider." There are phrases that define a presidency. 7 years ago, ask not what your country can do for you. And then there's, "I'm the decider." George W. Bush said it during a press conference, standing stiff, slightly smirking, exasperated with being second-guessed. He meant to assert authority. What came out sounded like a character from a children's fable laying down rules for nap time. But it stuck. It was folksy, blunt, utterly Bush. And somehow it captured the essence of his leadership style. Instinctive, absolute, and not particularly interested in nuance. The press ran with it. Comedians devoured it. Historians tilted their heads. But deep beneath the simplicity was something real. A president who viewed his job as a moral compass, not a committee chair. And while the grammar felt cartoonish, the sentiment was deadly serious. I make the call. I own the consequence. The quote turned into a meme before memes had a name. And as Bush reduced executive power into elementary school prose, Woodrow Wilson's face ended up somewhere most Americans would never see, printed on a bill worth more than most houses. Woodrow Wilson's face appears on the $100,000 bill, used only for internal bank transfers. You'll never hold it. You'll never see it in a wallet. It doesn't circulate. It wasn't meant to. And yet, there it is, the face of Woodrow Wilson, grim and professorial, staring out from the $100,000 bill. Created in 1934 during the Great Depression, the note was used strictly for transactions between Federal Reserve banks. It wasn't cash. It was ledger paper disguised as currency, a ceremonial ghost note. Wilson, who created the Federal Reserve System, was the logical choice. But the irony is thick. A man obsessed with control, whose presidency ended in silence and shadows, now immortalized on a bill that no one spends, no one holds, and no one quite trusts. It's a monument hidden in bureaucracy, a shrine built for function, not fame. Ask someone to name the face on the $100 bill. Easy. Ask about the 100,000? You'll get a blank stare. But Wilson's stare remains, cold and crisp, locked in a vault, passed hand to invisible hand like a secret handshake between giants. And if that feels strange, wait until you picture Abraham Lincoln, alone in the dark, chewing on tree bark. Abraham Lincoln chewed tree bark when deep in thought. In the middle of war, political collapse, and the slow-motion implosion of the American experiment, Abraham Lincoln sometimes found himself outdoors, standing quietly beside a tree, gnawing on its bark. Not as performance, not as a diet, just something he did. Lincoln, when overwhelmed by the weight of a nation's grief and the unbearable calculus of decisions with no good outcome, often turned to silence. And in that silence, tree bark became a kind of meditative anchor. He would chew it while pacing, while thinking, while grieving. Witnesses described it with a strange mix of awe and discomfort. It wasn't normal, but Lincoln wasn't built for normal. He didn't smoke, he didn't drink much, he brooded, and the bark gave him something tactile, something real, while everything around him unraveled. The trees bore silent witness to thoughts that would become proclamations, to metaphors that would later be carved into marble. And what did they give in return? A little bark, a little texture, something to chew while the world collapsed. And while Lincoln turned to trees for comfort, Ronald Reagan turned upward, to the stars, yes, but not metaphorically. He asked them when to act. Ronald Reagan consulted an astrologer before major decisions. It didn't come out until later, of course, after the speeches, after the Gipper mythology, after the Cold War curtain calls. That's when people learned. Ronald Reagan, Hollywood actor, Cold Warrior, master of optimism, consulted an astrologer before scheduling major decisions. Not casually, not jokingly, seriously. The astrologer hired by the First Lady reportedly helped determine when Air Force One should take off, when speeches should be delivered, when treaties should be signed. The stars, it seemed, knew things the Pentagon did not. To be clear, this wasn't New Age dabbling. This was operational. Reagan didn't talk about it publicly, but Nancy did. She said it was a response to the trauma of the assassination attempt. If bullets could fly without warning, maybe the planets offered some kind of control. Still, it begs the question, how many decisions, nuclear codes, diplomatic strategies, legislative pushes, were nudged by Mercury in retrograde? The most powerful man in the world, checking the moon's mood before calling Moscow. And while Reagan's rituals were cosmic, Chester Arthur's were deeply sartorial. Because the 21st president didn't just wear pants, he curated them like a religion. Chester Arthur changed his pants several times a day. He owned over 80 pairs. Chester A. Arthur, a man few remember and even fewer admire, had one indisputable obsession. Pants. Lots of them. Beautiful ones. Silk-lined, custom-tailored, French-stitched monuments to personal excess. He owned over 80 pairs. Not jeans, not trousers. Pants. Arthur was not a casual dresser. He was a walking showroom. Every change of scenery required a change of slacks. Morning meetings, gray pinstripe, afternoon luncheon, ivory linen, evening parlor talk, midnight blue with gold threading. He'd change multiple times a day, like a runway model stuck in a time loop. His staff called him the gentleman boss. He called it dignity. His tailor called it a full-time job. This wasn't just vanity, it was armor. Arthur believed a president must always look perfect, because his policies might be invisible. But his pants? They were right there. There's something tragically presidential about that. Crafting a legacy one inseam at a time. Knowing history might forget your laws, but never your lapels. And yet, while Arthur dazzled with fabric, Barack Obama earned applause through voice alone. One so polished it won him a Grammy. Barack Obama won a Grammy for audiobook narration. Presidents don't usually win Grammys. Wars, yes. Scandals, absolutely. But music's highest honor, not so much. And yet, Barack Obama, with his calm cadence and jazz-smooth delivery, walked away with one. Twice, actually. But the first time was for Dreams from My Father. His memoir, his voice, his tempo, his award. It wasn't just that he could speak. It's that he knew how to speak. There was rhythm in it. A rhetorical dance between vulnerability and command. When he read aloud his memories of Indonesia, of absence, of trying to stitch together an identity in a nation stitched with contradiction, it wasn't just a book. It was performance. And the Recording Academy agreed. So now, alongside treaties and campaign memorabilia, sits a golden gramophone, a reminder that sometimes charisma echoes louder than policy. That the power to move people isn't always written, it's spoken and recorded. But while Obama's vocal cords were celebrated with applause, James Monroe would have grunted disapproval. Why? Because his pet names weren't sweet, they were Roman. His cats weren't fluffballs, they were senators. James Monroe named his cats after ancient Roman senators. Most people give their pets cute names. Whiskers, Mittens, Mr. Paws. James Monroe. He named his cats after dead politicians from the Roman Republic. In Monroe's home, you weren't cuddling Fluffy, you were brushing Cato, feeding Cicero, scolding Brutus for knocking over the inkwell again. It wasn't a joke. Monroe, stoic and haunted by Enlightenment ideals, took classical history deadly seriously. The Roman Republic wasn't just bedtime reading. It was prophecy, warning, and mirror. So it made perfect sense to him that his cats, lounging in sunbeams, should carry the names of statesmen who died trying to save, or sometimes destroy, a republic. Imagine the scene. A quiet evening, candles flickering. Monroe in his study, debating the Missouri Compromise aloud. To a purring Tiberius. There's something bleakly hilarious about it. A president so consumed by the weight of history that even his house pets became historical reenactors. Did he think they carried the essence of their namesakes? Did he hope they'd remind him of honor, duty, the fragility of nations? Or maybe he just didn't like dogs. And if Monroe surrounded himself with feline philosophers, Franklin Pierce took a more arboreal approach to companionship. His favorite tree had a name, and possibly a soul. Franklin Pierce named his favorite tree Martha the Witness. Franklin Pierce, the grief-drenched, whiskey-soaked whisper of a president, didn't find solace in crowds or comfort in politics. He found it in a tree. Not just any tree. A tree he named Martha the Witness. It stood outside his New Hampshire home, weathered and still, and Pierce spoke of it not like a plant, but like a person. Martha wasn't merely a companion. She was a confessor, a witness to his thoughts, failures, losses, and maybe the last pieces of a conscience slowly unraveling under the weight of his own compromises. After the deaths of his children, after his wife receded into mourning and silence, Pierce would sit beneath Martha's branches for hours, not reading, not writing, just sitting, as if awaiting judgment or forgiveness, or both. He once referred to her in a letter not as it, but as she. She knew everything. She saw everything. And there's something deeply unsettling in that. A president, remembered by few, leaving behind no great speeches, no stirring policy, just a tree he begged to outlive his guilt. But if Pierce was defined by stillness, William Henry Harrison was defined by motion. A long speech, a cold wind, and a death sentence that began at his own inauguration. William Henry Harrison gave the longest inaugural speech and died 31 days later. It was cold, bitingly, stupidly cold. March 4th, 1841. And William Henry Harrison, at 68 years old, the oldest man ever elected president at that point, decided to deliver the longest inaugural speech in American history. Over 8,000 words. No coat, no hat, just grit, ego, and an ironclad commitment to saying everything. He stood in the icy wind for nearly 2 hours, declaiming Roman history, executive theory, and vague promises of unity. By the end, the crowd had stopped listening, but the cold had not. Harrison caught a chill. The chill turned into pneumonia. Pneumonia turned into silence. 31 days later, he was dead. The first president to die in office. His legacy, for many, boils down to a single sentence. He talked himself to death. And maybe that's fitting. A nation that worships speeches was reminded in its earliest years that words can't always save you. Sometimes they bury you. But Harrison's record-setting exit would be matched in modern times by a president who didn't freeze. He burned. Through headlines, norms, and 2 separate impeachments. Donald Trump didn't die in office. He got tried. Twice. Donald Trump is the only president to be impeached twice. It's the kind of sentence that sounds like a parody until you realize it's engraved into the actual official record. Donald J. Trump is the only president in U.S. history to be impeached twice. The first time, abuse of power and obstruction of Congress. The second, incitement of insurrection. 2 different Congresses, 2 different years, 2 entirely different scandals, tied together by one remarkable through line: the inability of anyone to look away. It didn't end in removal. It didn't even end in clarity. But the symbolism is permanent. Trump turned impeachment, a mechanism designed to be rare and solemn, into something almost procedural. A partisan reflex, a moral panic with a vote count. Some saw persecution, others saw precedent. Everyone saw spectacle. The trials became theater. Rhetoric turned feral. Senators became jurors, and then, within the same breath, campaigners. Trump walked away each time, untouched legally but scorched into the Constitution's footnotes with double asterisks. And while Trump refused to exit quietly, Andrew Johnson, another impeached president, refused to show up at all. Andrew Johnson refused to attend his successor's inauguration. On March 4, 1869, Ulysses S. Grant was sworn in as president. But Andrew Johnson, the man he replaced, and the first U.S. president ever impeached, was nowhere in sight. He wasn't sick. He wasn't detained. He just refused to go. He sat in the White House that morning signing last-minute legislation, pretending that the torch wasn't being passed, pretending the fire hadn't already burned him. The tradition of peaceful transfer, the symbolism of democracy in motion. Johnson skipped it. It was the final note in a presidency marked by bitterness, defiance, and constitutional debris. He had survived impeachment by a single Senate vote. But survival isn't vindication. So when the time came to shake hands and step aside, Johnson instead chose to vanish behind bureaucracy. No carriage ride with Grant, no farewell wave. Just silence, ink, and the echo of a man who couldn't leave with dignity, so he stayed behind with spite. In doing so, he set a precedent, not for honor, but for pettiness. Still, if Johnson left the stage unceremoniously, Bill Clinton made sure his final act came with saxophone, sunglasses, and late-night swagger. Bill Clinton once played saxophone on the Arsenio Hall show in sunglasses. Before the presidency, before impeachment, before policy, Bill Clinton stepped onto the stage of the Arsenio Hall show wearing sunglasses and clutching a saxophone like it was a campaign slogan in brass. The year was 1992. The vibe? Pure charisma. Slick Willie had arrived. He didn't speak at first. He didn't need to. He just nodded, lifted the sax, and launched into Heartbreak Hotel. The audience roared. Not because of technical skill, though he could definitely play, but because no other presidential candidate had ever tried so hard to look like the coolest guy at the barbecue. It worked. Overnight, Clinton wasn't just another politician. He was your politician, the one who knew rhythm, who could take a solo and still shake your hand after. The shades were less accessory, more armor, blocking out the judgment of anyone still clinging to the powdered wig version of leadership. Critics called it unserious. Voters called it refreshing. Either way, it was unforgettable. And if Clinton made the White House feel like a jazz club, Herbert Hoover's son gave it a swampy twist, adding 2 scaly house guests with very sharp teeth. Herbert Hoover's son had 2 pet alligators that roamed the White House. Imagine the marble halls of the White House. Crystal chandeliers, oil paintings, history dripping from the ceiling. And now imagine 2 alligators waddling down the hallway like they owned the place. Because they kinda did. Alan Hoover, son of President Herbert Hoover, kept 2 pet alligators during his father's administration. Not in cages, not in tanks, just around. They were allowed to roam freely, reportedly shocking guests and lurking near staircases with the casual menace of cold-blooded royalty. Why did anyone allow this? Probably because no one wanted to be the one to say, "Excuse me, young master, could we relocate the reptiles?" The alligators were a personal eccentricity that mutated into a presidential anecdote. Some accounts claim they lived in the conservatory. Others say they wandered the grounds. Either way, they existed, and they weren't decoration. They were a reminder that behind every administration's polished veneer, something unhinged is always pacing just out of frame. And while Hoover's son unleashed Jaws in the West Wing, James Madison feared the curve of his own lips. So much so, he refused to ever be painted smiling. James Madison refused to be painted smiling. He thought it made him look unserious. He was 5'4", bookish, and often mistaken for a clerk. But James Madison, the so-called father of the Constitution, had one absolute rule when it came to legacy. Don't make me smile. Portrait artists were instructed. Smiles were forbidden. A grin, to Madison, was weakness. Levity. A betrayal of the gravitas he had spent a lifetime cultivating. So instead, his face was set like wet cement, firm, expressionless, eyes half-lidded with Enlightenment-era disappointment. It wasn't vanity, it was calculation. Madison believed that the image of a leader should project seriousness, discipline, authority. A smile, he argued, was the domain of the unserious, the foolish, possibly even the French. He saw the presidency not as performance, but as posture. So he posed like a ghost who hadn't forgiven anyone. Ironically, those who knew him described him as warm, witty even. But none of that made it into the oil. All that survived was the scowl of a man who drafted entire branches of government and still found joy, offensive on canvas. And while Madison wrestled with how to appear, Lyndon B. Johnson had a very different approach. He installed a prank machine on wheels, disguised as a car, to terrify his guests. Lyndon B. Johnson had a car that simulated driving into a lake. He used it to prank visitors. Most people use their cars to go places. Lyndon B. Johnson used his to scare the hell out of people. At his Texas ranch, LBJ kept an amphibious vehicle, a white convertible that could drive both on land and water. But Johnson, being Johnson, never told his passengers that it could float. Instead, he'd invite unsuspecting guests, staffers, dignitaries, the occasional journalist, into the car, floor the gas, and aim directly at the nearest lake. As they screamed, bracing for impact, Johnson would let out a wild Texas laugh. Then the car would glide into the water like a motorized miracle. This wasn't a one-time gag. It was a favorite. He called it relaxing. His victims called it traumatic. But it says everything about the man. LBJ didn't just dominate policy. He dominated experience. The presidency wasn't enough. He needed to control fear, environment, even reality. And if that meant tricking people into believing they were about to drown, well, so be it. No therapy session could capture the layers of that stunt. And while LBJ terrorized visitors with watercraft deception, Calvin Coolidge quietly went in the opposite direction by doting on a raccoon as if it were a member of the cabinet. Calvin Coolidge insisted on having a raccoon as a pet. If you knocked on the door of the Coolidge White House, you might have been greeted not by a butler or bodyguard, but by a raccoon named Rebecca. Yes, President Calvin Coolidge kept a raccoon as a pet. Not as a mascot, not in a cage, as a pet. With a collar, her own bed, and full access to the presidential residence. Originally sent to the White House as a proposed Thanksgiving dinner, which is already unsettling, Coolidge took one look at her and decided, no, this one stays. He walked her on a leash, fed her by hand, built her a little treehouse. She was even listed in official records alongside other pets, like the ducks, the goose, and the bobcat. He would cradle her like a cat. She would climb on guests' shoulders. Diplomats learned quickly not to wear silk. Why? Because Coolidge, the famously silent president, seemed to relate more to animals than people, especially animals who didn't talk. He found their honesty comforting, their unpredictability manageable. People lied. Raccoons just washed things. And while Coolidge gave his raccoon the run of the residence, Joe Biden found himself having to send his dog away because the bites were no longer symbolic. Joe Biden's German Shepherd was sent away for biting Secret Service agents. Major, one of Joe Biden's German Shepherds, entered the White House with fanfare. Rescue dog, good boy, photogenic symbol of the American comeback story. But then the biting started. Not once, not twice. Repeated incidents, Secret Service agents, staffers, others who got too close. At first, the explanations were diplomatic. New environment, high stress, unfamiliar territory. But the truth was harder to leash. Major didn't like the vibe. Or maybe he liked it too much. Eventually, the decision was made. The dog had to go. Not forever, but far enough away that Jaws wouldn't keep making headlines. It was quietly devastating. Biden, a lifelong dog lover, didn't just lose a pet. He lost a companion in the public eye. And the press circled the story like it had teeth of its own. But maybe there's a metaphor here. Even the gentlest creature, when placed inside the vortex of American power, starts biting. The White House turns friends into threats and instincts into liabilities. And if Biden's shepherd couldn't be tamed, Abraham Lincoln proved that some presidents needed no leash at all, because he used to roam the Capitol at night, alone, unguarded, a ghost among the living. Abraham Lincoln used to walk alone through D.C. at night unguarded, in the middle of a civil war, while spies circled and plots thickened like smoke. Abraham Lincoln, President of the United States, target of enemies both foreign and domestic, used to walk alone through Washington, D.C. at night. No guards, no entourage, just his long shadow stretching across cobblestone and gaslight. He'd leave the White House quietly, often without telling anyone, and wander the streets, past soldiers, past the wounded, past his own thoughts. He needed to breathe, to think, maybe to remember what the Union looked like under moonlight instead of the maps. It terrified his staff. They begged him to stop. He didn't. He believed that if someone wanted to kill him, they would, and hiding wouldn't stop it. He also believed in listening, not just ruling, and sometimes the only voices that mattered came from strangers on park benches or from silence itself. It wasn't bravery. It was grief walking on 2 feet. And while Lincoln's hands remained empty on those night walks, George Washington kept his tightly to himself, never offering them, never reaching out, because the first president bowed instead of shaking hands. George Washington never shook hands. He bowed. In a nation that would become obsessed with the handshake, its firmness, its symbolism, its absurdly aggressive grip, George Washington refused to participate. He didn't shake hands, not once as president. Instead, he bowed. To allies, to opponents, to children and diplomats and soldiers. A measured, graceful tilt of the torso. A relic of old-world decorum in a country trying to define what New World even meant. Why? Because to Washington, the presidency was sacred theater. Touch was informal. A handshake made you equal. A bow maintained distance. It wasn't arrogance, it was architecture. Of myth, of dignity, of control. Some found it cold. Others found it majestic. Everyone remembered it. And it left a strange precedent. A republic built on the illusion of access, founded by a man who kept you one gesture away from intimacy. But while Washington's formality protected him, Franklin D. Roosevelt discovered that even elegance and secrecy can't shield you from a bullet meant for someone else. Franklin D. Roosevelt survived an assassination attempt, one that killed Chicago's mayor. It was February 1933. Roosevelt hadn't even been sworn in yet. He stood in Miami smiling, addressing a crowd from the back of an open car. Hope buzzed. A new president for a broken country. And then the shots rang out. 5 bullets, fired at close range. None of them hit Roosevelt. One struck and killed Chicago's mayor Anton Cermak, who stood beside him. The shooter, Giuseppe Zangara, claimed no hatred for Roosevelt specifically, just for politicians in general. He said his stomach hurt all the time and that all capitalists should be shot. He brought a pistol instead of a manifesto. Roosevelt stayed calm, didn't flinch, even comforted Cermak as he bled out beside him. The Secret Service swarmed. The country froze. It was a moment that could have changed everything, but didn't. Fate zigzagged. Death arrived, but not for the man it was aimed at. Roosevelt went on to lead through depression and war, with the memory of that night tucked somewhere deep beneath his wheelchair, because sometimes history hinges not on greatness, but on inches. And if Roosevelt escaped a bullet, Richard Nixon once refused to escape something far more mundane. Poorly aligned bowling shoes. Richard Nixon refused to use White House bowling shoes because they were improperly aligned. Richard Nixon, the only U.S. president to resign in disgrace, was also the only one to conduct a personal audit of the White House bowling shoes, and he rejected them. He didn't like the way they fit, or rather, the way they didn't fit. The angles felt off, the balance imperfect. They were, in his exact phrasing, improperly aligned. Not broken, not uncomfortable, improperly aligned. The moment is quietly deranged. The President of the United States, with Watergate unraveling behind the scenes, nuclear tensions simmering abroad, and democracy wobbling under the weight of his paranoia, fixating on footwear meant for 10-pin therapy. But Nixon wasn't after strikes. He was after control. Every detail mattered. Every shoelace, a referendum on order. The idea that the shoes didn't align with his internal axis was more than discomfort. It was betrayal. He brought his own pair from home after that. Because when the world collapses under you, the least you can do is ensure your shoes don't. And while Nixon wrestled with geometry on polished floors, Donald Trump had his sights set on something far larger and colder. He tried to buy Greenland. Yes, that Greenland. Donald Trump tried to buy Greenland. In 2019, Donald Trump floated a proposition that sounded less like diplomacy and more like a monopoly move gone feral. The United States should buy Greenland. Not rent, not co-develop. Buy. The idea reportedly came to him during a briefing, and he didn't laugh. He called it strategically interesting. Because Greenland, in Trump's eyes, wasn't a frozen wilderness. It was real estate. And all real estate, if priced right, was up for negotiation. Denmark, which technically owns Greenland, responded with a polite no. Trump was offended. He canceled a state visit in response. For a moment, U.S.-Danish relations were frostier than the glaciers he tried to purchase. But the most surreal part wasn't that he asked. It was that he expected it to work. That land, like buildings, had a list price. That history, geography, and sovereignty were just a few zoning hurdles on the path to acquisition. It was an act of pure Trumpism. Absurd, brash, and weirdly on-brand. And while Trump lived in black and white offers, buy or don't, Martin Van Buren operated in an entirely different palette. He refused to answer yes or no questions at all. Martin Van Buren refused to answer yes or no questions, claiming truth resides in the gray. Martin Van Buren, the sly, sideburned architect of political machinery, had a unique approach to communication. He didn't believe in yes or no. Ask him a question. Wait for a clean answer. You'd get fog. To Van Buren, absolutes were lies in disguise. He believed the truth, if it existed at all, lived in nuance, ambiguity, and elaboration. Truth, he once said, resides in the gray, a poetic dodge, a philosophical smoke bomb, and also incredibly effective. Reporters hated it. Rivals found it maddening. But Van Buren understood that firm answers end conversations. Ambiguity prolongs power. He pioneered the art of saying nothing so carefully that it sounded like insight, the original political ghostwriter of vagueness. And perhaps that's why he's remembered not for bold moves or dramatic stances, but for being everywhere and nowhere at once, an operator without fingerprints. It's not charisma, it's slipperiness, elevated to philosophy. And while Van Buren stayed in the gray, Jimmy Carter once tried to brighten the future, literally, by installing solar panels on the White House roof, only to have them torn down in the next administration like a forgotten prophecy. Jimmy Carter installed solar panels on the White House. Reagan later removed them. In 1979, with an oil crisis looming and the planet quietly inching toward climate catastrophe, Jimmy Carter climbed up on the White House roof and unveiled the future. Solar panels, glinting in the D.C. sun. They weren't just energy efficient. They were symbolic. A gesture of humility, innovation, responsibility. He said, "A generation from now, this solar heater can either be a curiosity, a museum piece, or a small part of one of the greatest adventures ever undertaken by the American people." Spoiler alert, it became a museum piece. When Ronald Reagan took office, he had the panels quietly dismantled. No speech, no ceremony, just off they went, like a failed science project removed before company came over. Maybe it was about messaging, maybe aesthetics. Maybe he just didn't like reminders of peanut farming idealism. But in that moment, the solar panels stopped being tech. They became a metaphor, a cautionary tale of how fragile progress is, how easily hope is unscrewed and hauled away. Carter tried to put the sun to work. Reagan put it back in the sky. And while Carter's legacy faded upward, Harry Truman's was stuck somewhere stranger, between two initials and a middle name that didn't even exist. Harry Truman's middle initial S doesn't stand for anything. You've seen it 100 times. Harry S. Truman. Middle initials lend gravity, authority. The S suggests lineage, legacy, some revered ancestor passed down through family history like an heirloom. Except it stood for nothing, literally. Just the letter S. No name behind it, no secret origin. His grandfathers, Solomon and Shipp, were both contenders, but his parents couldn't decide. So they split the difference, gave him the S, and never filled in the blank. Truman himself didn't seem to mind. He signed documents with the flourish of that dangling middle initial like it was the most important letter in the world. A void disguised as certainty. Typographers still argue over whether the period after the S is necessary. Truman used it, so we do. But the irony is rich. A man who authorized the most decisive act in modern warfare, twice, carried a middle name that meant absolutely nothing. A blank space in cursive. History loves meaning. Truman loved results. And while he carried his phantom S through atomic-age diplomacy, George W. Bush barreled through his own presidency with a code name that sounded less like a commander-in-chief and more like someone doing cartwheels at recess. George W. Bush's Secret Service nickname was Tumbler. Every president gets a Secret Service code name, a shorthand alias used over radios and on security details. Reagan was Rawhide. Obama was Renegade. Cool, strong, inevitable. George W. Bush's Tumbler. Like a gymnast. Or a drinking glass. Or someone who rolls awkwardly into things. On the surface, it sounds like a joke. But code names aren't random. They're submitted, approved, and often selected with the input of the protectee. So someone, maybe Bush himself, picked Tumbler on purpose. And in a way, it fits. Bush was known for a certain physical clumsiness. He once fell off a Segway, choked on a pretzel, duck-dodged a pair of shoes in Iraq with the reflexes of a man who's definitely tumbled before. But Tumbler also suggests resilience. Someone who falls, then stands, trips, then keeps moving. A body in motion, never quite polished, never quite broken. That nickname wasn't just about coordination. It was about kinetic momentum. A presidency that moved fast, stumbled often, but never stopped spinning forward. And while Bush's moniker hinted at simplicity, Barack Obama once wrote college love letters so dense they name-dropped Nietzsche. Because of course he did. Barack Obama wrote love letters in college that referenced Nietzsche, long before the podiums, the teleprompters, and the rhythmic crescendos of campaign poetry. Barack Obama was just a college student in love, and writing about it the way only a future president might, with an unhealthy dose of Nietzsche. Yes, Nietzsche, the mustached prophet of existential dread. The guy who said God was dead and meant it. That Nietzsche. In his love letters, Obama mused not only on affection and longing, but on selfhood, alienation, the eternal recurrence, and the will to power. Because nothing says romantic intimacy like telling someone that the universe is indifferent and your love might just be a metaphysical accident. And yet, it worked. Because even then Obama was a writer. His emotions came bundled with footnotes. He wasn't trying to be pretentious. He was trying to be understood in a world that seemed designed to misunderstand him. Love was philosophy. Desire was language. And dating was just a battlefield where ideas wrestled with hormones. His letters weren't sexy. They were serious. And if Obama found identity through romantic introspection, John Adams chose a more mathematical route. He counted how many people respected him. Every single day. John Adams kept track of how many people respected him daily. John Adams had a habit. Not a vice, not a hobby, a ritual. Each day he would assess, quietly, obsessively, how many people respected him, and he'd write it down. It wasn't ego. It was measurement. Proof that dignity, though invisible, could be tallied like coins in a ledger. Friends, enemies, family, foreign dignitaries, Adams tracked them all. Who nodded in the hallway? Who praised his speeches? Who stood when he entered a room? He weighed these social micro-moments like gold dust, as if reputation itself could be quantified and filed for judgment. Why? Because he knew he wasn't Washington. He wasn't Jefferson. He wasn't loved. So he settled for being counted. It's deeply human and deeply tragic. Adams was a brilliant, thorny man, wrapped in insecurity and armed with principles. He didn't crave affection, he craved acknowledgement, validation, that someone, somewhere, knew he was trying to hold the republic together with stubbornness and ink. If his soul had a currency, it was respect, and he spent his life trying to earn it. But while Adams was busy watching people, James K. Polk was staring at something else entirely: owls. Specifically, reincarnated prophet owls. James K. Polk believed owls were reincarnated prophets. James K. Polk, the most intense introvert to ever expand a nation's borders, harbored a belief that would make even seasoned mystics raise an eyebrow. He thought owls were reincarnated prophets, not metaphorically, literally. He believed that some owls carried the souls of ancient sages, watching from the trees, hooting truths in cryptic syllables, blinking through dimensions like feathery messengers of fate. To Polk, the owl wasn't just a symbol of wisdom, it was wisdom. Perched, alive, possibly judging him. There are stories of him pausing walks to stare at owls, whispering to them, interpreting their calls. He never mocked them. He never shooed them away. These weren't birds. They were guides. In a presidency defined by relentless ambition, territorial conquest, manifest destiny, maps rewritten with ink and blood, Polk still made time to consult the trees, because some part of him believed that the past, the divine, and the owl were all one thing. It's absurd. It's beautiful. It's terrifying. A man expanded an empire while secretly believing that nocturnal birds might be ancient voices offering moral counsel.